Hello, I'm Tomas Gabor, Managing Director of Sysco Environmental. For over 20 years, I've been investigating mold, damp and indoor air quality problems in homes, workspaces and buildings across the UK. In our previous episodes, we look at what mold is, why it grows and why it can affect our health. And why it often keeps coming back. Today I'd like to answer another question we ask at almost every investigation. What actually happens during professional mold investigation? Many people imagine that we simply walk into a property, look at the mold, take a few photographs and recommend cleaning products. In reality, the professional investigation is much more comprehensive because we are not really investigating the mold, we are investigating the building. We are trying to understand why the building is allowing mold to grow. Every investigation starts long before we use any specialist equipment. It starts by asking questions. When did the problem first appear? Has it always been there? Or is it seasonal? Does it get worse during winter? Has there ever been a leak, a flood, or building work carried out? Has the property recently had new windows fitted? Has the insulation been upgraded? How many people live here? How do you heat the property? How do you ventilate it? These questions are incredibly important because they often provide our first clues. Mold is rarely random. There is usually a story behind it. Once we build a picture, we begin a detailed visual investigation. Now we are not simply looking at the mold itself, we are looking at the whole building. We are looking at water staining, peeling paints, damaged plaster, condensation of windows, cold external walls, blocked air vents, poor extraction fans, roof defects, damaged guttering, bridging around the windows, anything that may explain how moisture is entering or remaining inside the building. Quite often, the visible mold is only a very small part of much larger moisture. The next stage is measuring moisture. This is probably one of the most important parts of the entire investigation, because mold cannot grow without moisture. We use specialist moisture meters to determine whether building materials are actually wet. That helps us to understand whether we are dealing with condensation, a plumbing leak, or a penetrating damp, where moisture is actually inside the structure of the building. Different materials tend to behave differently. Timber behaves differently to plasterboard. Concrete behaves differently to brick. Understanding those readings takes a little bit of experience. Moisture meter doesn't give you the answer on its own. It provides another piece of evidence. One of the most useful tools we use is thermal imaging. People often think thermal cameras detect damp. Well, actually, they don't. They detect differences in surface temperature. And why is that useful? Because mold almost always develops on the coldest surface inside a room. Thermal imaging allows us to identify cold bridges, missing insulation, poorly insulated lintels, the areas where condensation is more likely to occur. Combined with moisture measurements, it gives us a much clearer understanding of what's happening inside the building. Next, we look at the indoor environment itself. We measure temperature, relative humidity, and where appropriate, carbon dioxide level. Because people create moisture every single day. Cooking, showering, drying clothes, and even breathing all releases water into. If that moisture isn't removed through adequate ventilation, relative humidity increases. As humidity increases, the likelihood of condensation also increases. So we are not simply measuring numbers. We are assessing whether the building is providing an environment where mold could thrive. Do we always test for mold? The answer is no. That often surprises people. If mold is clearly visible on the wall, sampling doesn't really tell us anything we don't already know. The mold is there, we can see it. However, sampling becomes extremely valuable when we are investigating hidden mold. And also when we're trying to understand airborne exposure or confirming that remediation has been successful. Air sampling allows us to compare indoor air with the outdoor air. If indoor spore concentrations are significantly higher, that's an important piece of evidence. But mold sampling is just one tool. It's never the whole investigation. By the end of the survey, We gathered a fairly large amount of information. We have spoken with the occupants, we investigated the building, and we measured moisture. We assessed humidity, we used thermal imaging, we looked at ventilation, and where appropriate, we carried out laboratory sampling. Only when we can bring all that evidence together, that's when patterns begin to emerge. That's when we identify the real cause, because our objective isn't simply to explain why mold is there today, it's to understand how it stops coming back next winter and winter after that. I'll give you an example. We have recently been asked to investigate mold affecting a ceiling at the top floor apartment. The occupant believed that bathroom extraction had failed. It seems like a perfectly reasonable assumption. But when we carry out our investigation, the evidence told a completely different story. The thermal imaging, moisture measurements, and the roof inspection all pointed towards a failed roof flashing. The rainwater was entering through the roof, traveling along the ceiling void, and appearing several meters away from where it had actually entered the building. Had we simply replaced the extractor fan, the mold would almost certainly have returned. Instead, the roof defect was repaired. The building was allowed to dry and affected materials were remediated. And then the mold, didn't come back. That's why understanding the building is so important. One of the biggest misconceptions we hear is this: mold investigations are just mold testing. In reality, testing is often a small part of what we do. Understanding the building, understanding the moisture, understanding the ventilation, and understanding how people use that building is usually far more important than identifying the mold itself. So if there is one thing I'd like you to remember from today's episode, professional mold investigations don't begin by asking, what mold is it? They begin by asking, why is this building allowing mold to grow? Once you answer that question, you are much closer to solving your problem permanently. In our next episode, we are going to explore mold testing in much more detail. I'll explain what a spore trap sampling is, when it's useful, when it isn't, and how professionals interpret laboratory results. Because collecting data is only half of the job. Understanding what the data actually means is what experience really counts. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in our next episode.